Colonel William Moultrie could feel the grit under his boots, a fine powder of sand and sawdust that coated everything on Sullivan's Island. It was June, and the air was a thick, wet blanket you could chew on. His men worked stripped to the waist, their backs slick with sweat, wrestling the massive palmetto logs into place. The logs weren't elegant. They were thick, fibrous, and oddly soft, absorbing the blow of a misplaced axe rather than splitting. Between the outer and inner log walls, they packed sand, 16 feet of it, creating a crude bulwark that looked more like a giant beach berm than a proper military fort. From the deck of a British man of war, it must have looked pathetic, an insult to the science of Vauban. Moultrie knew. He also knew it was all they had. That unfinished pile of sand and spongy wood was the cork in the bottle of Charleston, and Charleston was the prize of the American South. From offices in Whitehall, the map looked simple. The southern colonies were supposedly teeming with Loyalists, just waiting for the sight of redcoats to rise up and restore royal authority. Take Charleston, the region's wealthiest port and logistical hub, and the entire rebellion south of Virginia would wither. Admiral Sir Peter Parker's fleet, a forest of mass carrying the guns of the world's most powerful navy, and General Henry Clinton's army of regulars were not just there to capture a city. They were there to execute the Crown's southern strategy and surgically remove a continent's lower half from the revolution. The plan began to fray long before the first cannonball was fired. The fleet's voyage across the Atlantic was a nightmare of winter storms that scattered ships from the West Indies to Rhode Island. When they finally regrouped off Cape Fear, North Carolina, they were weeks behind schedule. Men were on two-thirds rations, and tempers were short. The psychological friction of delay and deprivation had already taken a toll. The British command structure, built on the clockwork precision of European warfare, was being ground down by the simple tyranny of distance and weather. Their military engineers took one look at Moultrie's fort and laughed. They were accustomed to stone and brick, materials that shattered under the percussive force of a 32-pound ball. Their own ships were masterpieces of oak, stout timbers that could turn aside enemy fire, but would explode into a cloud of lethal splinters when hit squarely. They had no frame of reference for the palmetto. The soft, fibrous wood didn't splinter. It absorbed the impact, the dense grain swallowing cannonballs whole. The kinetic energy that should have blasted the wall to pieces simply dissipated into the 16 feet of sand packed behind the logs. The fort was a sponge, designed by circumstance to soak up punishment. The fatal error, however, came from a failure of intelligence on the ground. General Clinton's plan was a classic pincer movement. While Parker's warships pounded the fort from the front, Clinton's 2,200 regulars would cross Breach Inlet, the shallow channel separating Sullivan's Island from Long Island where they had landed, and storm the fort's weak rear wall. His scouts had assured him the channel was, at most, 18 inches deep at low tide. An easy wade, they were catastrophically wrong. When the time came to cross, Clinton's men found not a sandbar but a treacherous channel, with currents running like a mill race and holes plunging to 7 feet deep. The amphibious assault was over before it began. Clinton and his army became spectators to the Navy's duel. On the morning of June 28th, Parker's ships advanced. His captains were masters of their craft, skillfully navigating the treacherous Charleston Bar, a series of shifting sandbanks local pilots called the Infernal Bar. Anchoring in the tidal currents, they put out spring lines, secondary cables attached to the main anchor line, which allowed them to winch their ships' hulls around like a door on a hinge, bringing the full weight of their broadside cannons to bear on the rebel fort. The bombardment began, a rolling thunder that shook the island. The British theory of war was based on volume. A fortress was a mathematical problem to be solved with a sufficient application of iron. Inside the fort, the Americans were running out of gunpowder. Moultrie's gunners couldn't afford to trade broadsides. They fired with a slow, deliberate cadence, aiming for hulls and rigging, making every shot count. For 10 hours, the spongy walls held. Then, a British shot severed the flagpole. The blue flag with its white crescent fell outside the bastion. On the British ships, Cheers went up. The symbol of surrender had been given. But on the wall, Sergeant William Jasper of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment yelled to Moultrie, "Colonel, don't let us fight without our flag." He vaulted over the wall, heedless of the cannon fire, retrieved the banner, and finding no pole, lashed it to a gun sponge, the long rammer used for swabbing the cannon barrel. He jammed the makeshift staff into the top of the rampart. It was a classic piece of battlefield improvisation, fixing a failure of equipment with sheer nerve. The final British gambit was a flanking maneuver by three of the smaller frigates. They attempted to slip past the main battle line into a channel that would allow them to enfilade the fort's gun platforms. They ran directly aground on a submerged sandbar. The hydrographic reality of the harbor had crippled both the Army's crossing and the Navy's maneuver. Asterisk managed to pull themselves free. Asterisk was stuck fast, a helpless target for the American guns. When the tide turned and Parker's fleet finally withdrew, the butcher's bill was brutally one-sided. The British had suffered 220 casualties. The Americans, protected by their sand and soft wood, counted only 37. The next morning, the crew of the Asterix set her ablaze and abandoned her, leaving the rebels to salvage her guns and bell. The European rules of war, which dictated that a wooden fleet would always defeat a fixed fortification, had been broken. The British had brought the finest military engineering of the age, only to see it defeated by the unique physics of a local swamp cabbage tree. They had planned for a battle of tactics and firepower, but they found themselves in a fight against the land itself. The sand, the tides, and the spongy Palmetto had voted against the king.